Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and this is Talk That Pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. My guest today is Jerry Landry, creator of the Presidencies of the United States podcast. It's a show that explores American presidential history from 1789 till now, and the show examines lesser-known narratives, overlooked figures, and surprising connections that rarely appear in textbooks. Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Sebastian. And what an honor it is, and especially being considered somebody interesting to talk to. I love that.
Of course. Okay, so you launched the podcast in 2017, which is right after what we can certainly look back on now as kind of a watershed political moment. I'm curious, how much was the 2016 election a direct motivation for starting the show? And did you want to sort of go in to draw historical parallels to present day politics?
Well, I will start with the first part. Yes, it was very much a motivator in starting Presidencies to that point. So to take us back quite a few years, I had engaged in a project to read a presidential biography on each president from the very beginning, and finished that up around, I think it was 2015 or so. And I got to thinking about, what's next? What do I do now? And my better half had the idea of starting a podcast. Well, I was fascinated by William Henry Harrison, the ninth president, thus far the shortest presidential term, 1 month. And so I started the Harrison podcast first. But with the 2016 election, and as you said, it was an unusual election, to say the least. And I kept getting questions from listeners of the podcast, but even more so in my day-to-day life, from friends, colleagues, just asking, what about this? What have we seen anything like this before? What's the precedent for this? And as I was answering those questions, I realized I needed to take my work back a bit. And so I came up with the Presidencies of the United States, starting with the presidency of George Washington, because I felt it was important to put things into context. And for me, that is one of the primary drivers for studying history, is to try and understand how we got to the present day. But also for me, I find strength in understanding the challenges of the past, because in some respects, we're still dealing with some of those same challenges, and to know that people have been working on this for a while, it feels like we're a part of something greater. But then also to see where folks have overcome challenges in the past, it gives me hope. It gives me motivation that we too can meet our historical challenges. We can meet the historical moment. And so hopefully that's something that listeners of Presidencies get, that, we're not alone. This isn't the first time, nor will it be the last, that folks are challenged with certain things. And hopefully in learning the lessons of the past and finding strength from the past, we can figure out a way to move forward.
Now, from what I understand and based on what I've seen, the way you structure your research is that you kind of build it around a few core questions. How did each president approach the office? What major events affected their, tenure? Were there pivotal developments during that? And what was sort of historically significant? And I'm wondering, I guess it's a two-parter as well. One, how did you arrive at that framework? And two, have there been any presidencies you've looked at that didn't really fit that mold, and maybe that framework didn't work for that particular presidency?
Well, and I'll say it's interesting to think of it as a framework. For me, it really evolved from my previous study, going through a presidential biography of each president. So that kind of helped me when I was thinking of the podcast. What are the commonalities, the common approaches that we can take, realizing that each presidency is different. And that's one of the things that I went into presidencies with, that it's got to be flexible enough to deal with the differences in each of the presidencies. But in that, we want to understand, because each of them does have an influence on the evolution of the greater office. It has an influence on U.S. history, and in many cases, and that's been one of the things over the years that I've been leaning more into, that, history doesn't start or stop at a border. Those borders are human imposed. It's not the be all and end all reality. We realize that things cross over. And so really thinking of this in terms of a global context. But I think that it is a good framework for kind of thinking through all of these, but at the same time, opening up that possibility of, what else do we need to explore? Because, and one of the things that I started from the very beginning with presidencies is that the presidency isn't just about one person. It's not just about the person who holds the office of chief executive, because no person is an island. Even with the early presidencies, they still needed other folks to be able to do what they did, or in some cases, not do what they did. It's a larger story, and that's what I love about it, getting into the complexities of it, because that's where you really get to understand that this is a human story. It isn't just names and dates and figures. It's people.
So to pull on that thread a little bit more, I think one of the more distinctive things about your podcast is the depth that you give other figures, cabinet members, first ladies, vice presidents. What made you decide to sort of go deep into, I guess, the supporting cast and have any of those sort of secondary figures ended up surprising you?
Well, and I'll say it's one of those things that it started from the very beginning, and I've adjusted how I've done it, how I've approached it over time. But it really started with, first ladies. I dedicate at least one episode of each presidential series, each, season, if you will, to the first lady or whoever was acting in that role. Because as we know, Thomas Jefferson was the first. He was a widower when he became president. And I decided that I wanted to talk about his wife, even though she wasn't around for the presidency, but then also his two daughters, because each of them had a role to play in the story of his presidency, of his career, of his life. And that's important to capture. Again, no person is an island. They're influenced by these people. But then I decided, and honestly, I wish that I would have been doing this from the very beginning, but I decided that I wanted to launch kind of a side series, a seat at the table, focusing in on the cabinet members. And in that, learning from their perspective how things were happening, getting a better sense of what their agenda may have been or what was happening with them, it helped to make the story so much richer. It helped that history to become not just one focus, one person, but a more human story. And since then, I've started a series on vice presidents, which started kind of as a joke, April Fools. I had posted to my social media, I'm abandoning these presidents. I'm turning it into the vice presidencies of the United States. And little did I know how excited people would be by that. I was like,
wow,
are you sure? Okay, well, let's see what happens. And that has been surprising, because vice presidents up until modern history, with a few notable exceptions, Aaron Burr, I'm looking at you, they don't really get much focus when you're talking about the presidency, because
right,
they really weren't. They were the president of the Senate. They were seen as more of a legislative role versus being in the executive branch. And that's been only in still recent history that that's changed. But in looking at them, again, we get that there was so much more going on. They would sometimes have an impact that you may not see, that you may miss if you're just focused on the presidency. But of course, the president depends on legislation from Congress. But also, these folks have an agenda of their own, and they may be over in the Senate acting against the executive. So that's been important to bring in. In terms of one that surprised me, there have been a few that have surprised me. I think the first one that I was really like, why don't we know more about this person, was Benjamin Stoddart. So he was the first Secretary of the Navy under John Adams. Again, if you're just focused on John Adams, you may see him in a few notes, but you may miss that he was a key figure in the cabinet at a time that, John Adams inherited George Washington's cabinet. Again, he was the first person actually succeeding another president. And there wasn't really a precedent for, well, you just get all new cabinet members. He was like, well, George Washington picked these folks, so who am I to say George Washington was wrong? And that turned into a whole debacle because this cabinet was not there for John Adams until you get Benjamin Stoddart. He becomes the first person that John Adams actually chooses, and he becomes kind of this key figure that Adams was able to rebuild his cabinet around. Like, Stoddart came in and he's like, Mr. President, these people are all acting against you. Why are they still here? But you don't get that if you just study John Adams. But when you start to look at it from Benjamin Stoddart's viewpoint, you see he brings this outsider perspective that he's able to start shining a light on this can change. But since then, there's been so many, and I love those hidden gems, those folks that I wish we knew more about. And it's such a pleasure to be able to share with listeners these figures that are really fascinating once you start looking into them.
Yeah, discovering those sort of little known stories seems to be, a big part of the fun, I think, for a lot of history podcasters. But, I'm a huge history buff and I love listening to history podcasts. I devour them. And one of the things that I'm always thinking about in the back of my head is, what's the difference between history podcasts that go on to have, a lot of success, a lot of longevity, and the ones that don't. And I think one of the things that it comes down to is the writing process and how certain podcasters, like yourself as well, are able to make that historical material feel like a story rather than a lecture. And I'm wondering how you do that in your writing process.
Well, and I'll be honest, it is something that it was something that helped motivate me to start the podcast, because as I started talking about it and as I started talking with people, and especially, like I said, the 2016 election, so many folks were coming and asking me questions, and quite a few of them, once I was done explaining or done talking something through, they were like, you really helped to connect the dots for me. You made it in such a way that I could understand it. And I see my role as a history podcaster because I do engage with the very academic work, and I'm so glad that it is out there. There is amazing scholarship that is being done every day. Our history scholars do not get nearly enough credit, kudos for the work that they're doing. So I see myself as kind of that bridge, helping to bring that scholarship to a more general audience that would not have otherwise engaged with it. And hopefully I encourage folks to dive into that scholarship. I realize some of it may be dense, and especially studying financial history of the U.S., I've had times that I've had to reread things a few times before it really comes together, or I may have to look up a few things. And it's important to engage with that scholarship. And so I hope that in my role that I am able to do that. But I realize that it is, and again, my better half has given me such wisdom over the years. One of the things that he said years back was, sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And so I keep that in mind. I try and think of the listener. How am I going to help them to understand, knowing that all that they've got is my voice? I don't have any charts. I don't have any maps that I can necessarily show them right then and there. What am I doing to make it approachable with how I'm delivering the content? So
Right. You've been doing this since 2017. That's almost a decade of work. And in all that time and all the work that you've put in, the research that you've put in, has your sort of interpretation of the presidency itself evolved as you've moved through, the different eras of the Republic?
I think yes and no. One of the things coming into this work, having gone through a biography of each of the presidents, I'd already kind of came with an idea of how it would evolve. I think for me, the thing that I'm still trying to make sure that I include in the podcast, but then also is still something that I wrestle with as I approach this work, is thinking of how it impacts the people and how what's going on the ground may impact the presidency and vice versa. In the earlier presidencies, there is more of a disconnect, what's happening on the ground in Georgia or Vermont may not be directly impacted each day by what's happening in the nation's capital, because at that point, the federal government was minuscule compared to what it is nowadays. In the 20th century, we really see, with the advent of communication, of, faster transportation, we see that the presidency leading into the modern day can have much more of a direct impact on the day-to-day lives of Americans, and even, having a global impact. And so it's always fascinating, and I think that's one thing that when I intentionally pause and think of what that looks like at the time that I'm studying, it becomes kind of a checkpoint for me that, okay, here's where the presidency is evolving. Here's where we're seeing more of that impact. It helps me to kind of really put it all into a larger perspective.
Now, the topic of AI is a bit thorny amongst creators, amongst podcasters, amongst historians as well. I'm curious if you now use any AI tools in your research, and has that changed the way you think about the research process at all?
It's interesting. So in talking about AI, and I have told folks that's one of my gauges for kind of where AI is, and in comparing different platforms, because I am so immersed in U.S. presidential history, I will ask it some obscure question like, who were the cabinet members under James Monroe? And
Right.
seeing how off it is. And years back, whenever I did that for the first time, it was pretty off. It's getting closer to the factual, but it was interesting to see the different variations. And I would, go ahead and ask follow-up questions. Can you verify that? Can you find some sources for that? I think that just like with any tool, it's something that we should approach with caution. It can be helpful, but I think that there are also clear limitations of it. In terms of my research, I tend not to use AI. I am starting to use it because I do have some side research projects that I'm doing. I'm hoping one of these days to be able to publish. And with that, I've got tons of sources, and trying to evaluate whether a source is something that I really need to do a deep dive into can be a challenge just on the surface. And so I do have some tools that I will use. Go ahead and tell me, how is this subject or character covered in this? Can you tell me kind of what the relevance is? Being able to ask those questions, to be able to have AI dive into the source for me, helps me to understand, is this something I need to do a deep dive into, or is this just maybe I read a couple of pages and I'm done? But I still rely on myself to do the actual research. Really, how I use AI in podcasting, and so in terms of recording, I use Riverside, and they've incorporated some AI features to be able to help you to think through, what a summation may look like for it, thinking through like a title. It does help with that kind of brainstorming. I still do some tweaks from there, but it is nice to have kind of that starting point instead of just having the blank page and, oh my gosh, how do I describe this episode? So that has been helpful, but like I say, it's just something to approach with caution, finding how you can use it, and also being sure that you're trusting yourself to do the research and to do the writing. AI is a tool. It's not a replacement, and it shouldn't be, because part of the research work and part of podcasting is bringing your unique look to it, your unique perspective. That's what people are looking for. The facts are there for anybody. It's how do we deliver it? How do we help folks to understand it? And that requires our insight as individuals.
Now, I want to move on and start talking a little bit about what you've done to promote the podcast and how you've grown it. So I'm particularly interested in what your approach has been, especially at the beginning. What were the things you tried early on for growth? And are there, things that succeeded? Are there things that failed? Are there things that, if you were starting today, you would recommend to other podcasters to try?
So I always tell folks, and especially, when folks approach me that they're thinking about starting a podcast and just trying to figure out whether to go ahead and do that. And you had mentioned earlier that, there are the podcasters who have been around for the long haul, and then there are those who kind of drop off.
Mm-hmm.
I always advise folks, think of, is this something that you're really passionate about? Is this something that you're going to be able to sustain? Or is this just oh, well, this sounds kind of cool, maybe I'll do this? And it's not even to say that if your answer is more of the latter, that it's necessarily a no. But you also have to think of, and one of the things that I started with was, if nobody listens, do I still feel that this is a valuable use of my time?
Right.
And I came to the point that, yes, this is something that I'm passionate about. This is something that I want to do. And we'll see what happens. At least I can say that I tried. And since then, I'm very grateful, and my audience knows I constantly thank them because, they are sticking around. They are the ones who help to fuel this work, just knowing, and those interactions are just so great to be able to have. I think, if anything else, that has helped me to really engage with this deeper, is in having those conversations and having that back and forth with audience members. In terms of my approach to social media, I just started. I knew that social media needed to be a part of this. And again, like as folks are thinking of what they want to do with their podcast, if they're really focused on growth, social media's got to be a part of it. Some are just in it for fun, and that may not be their ultimate goal, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I've approached social media and I've tried different platforms over the years. I would say try and figure out in terms of what you're offering, in terms of what your podcast is, what may be the best fit, because the different platforms have different vibes. There are some that are more, quick, short posts, or they may be more focused on photos, videos, whatever. If that's what you're aiming for, go there. If you're looking for longer text, there are platforms for that as well. And the type of folks that you're going to engage with are different on all of them. And so it may be good to experiment, or if you're already familiar with the social media platforms, you may be geared more towards one than the other. But I would caution, don't feel like you've got to do everything, because if it becomes more about social media than about the podcasting, then you're focused more on social media. And that's great. And again, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. For me, I do have to balance that. I love to be able to reach out to new listeners, to existing listeners, to be able to have those conversations. And I've also got to have time to do the research and the recording and editing and all of that. So it really is a balance of where's your time being spent, and know your limitations. Know that you don't have to do everything all at once forever, because you can't.
Is there a particular social media channel that has worked best for your particular podcast in terms of driving new listeners?
It's interesting. I think that it's brought in different types of listeners. I think I probably have more interactions on, the formerly known as Twitter, on Blue Sky. But I'm starting to see some increased interactions in Instagram. I do have some interactions on Threads, and then Facebook as well. But it's really different. And I've had to learn over the years, what am I going to put out there, and what are folks going to be interested in? And it's also helped me to grow. Like with Instagram, knowing that it is more visually based, it's made me think of, how do I up my game in terms of the, cover art, in terms of what kind of images I want to share. I've dabbled in video over time. I'm still trying to get my head wrapped around that, but also the AI tools in Riverside has helped with that, because they do the quick clips that I can start to post to platforms like that. So it's helped me to grow in that way, with like the formerly known as Twitter and Blue Sky. Because you have a character limit, it's made me and have to be more succinct in my post. And so it's made me think about, okay, well, how can I say this in a quick and easy way that's still going to be impactful? So that's been good. I think that folks have come from all of them, and it's just in trying to figure out how to connect. I think once I start to do that, that's where I start to draw new listeners in. And right. It's really a continued experiment.
Yeah. Have you done guesting on other podcasts, and have you found any success there in terms of driving listeners as well?
I have. So let's see, I think I'm up to probably been on like 25, 30 different podcasts over the years for different things, mostly around presidential history, but also I've done guest appearances for, other, whether it's leadership or just some special topic. And I love being able to do that. And, I said when I came on here, it's interesting to be in the guest seat because I'm used to being the host and driving everything, but it's nice to be in this seat for once. But it is an interesting interaction. I love being able to go on, to be able to have different conversations, to see how other folks are approaching things. And I have gotten listeners from those appearances. And I'll have folks who reach out and they're like, hey, I heard you on, Totalis Rankium. I heard you on Civics and Coffee. I'm so glad that I found you. And I always tell folks that podcasting community, and I can't speak to all podcasting communities, but the history podcasting community is just a great place. We are so supportive of one another. We want to help one another. And so those collaborations are so important. It also just, I think, helps us to feel like we're not alone in this. We all do have a unique take on it, and we can learn from one another and with one another. But we all bring some unique perspective to it. And the variety is truly the spice of life.
And in terms of the structure of your audience, have you noticed if you have sort of a cohort of casual listeners versus people that are, hardcore fans of your show that have been listening for a long time? And if yes, what do each of those groups want from your podcast?
Well, and it's been interesting, I know that some podcasters don't dive into the statistics quite as much as I do. I'm a data geek, so of course I love being able to explore. So I know that there are some folks who just, will jump in for, a certain topic, or, maybe they'll start at the beginning and they take some time to work through. I do have a core group of listeners. I recently was honored. I was listed on a top 15 list of U.S. history podcasts. And one of the things that they said in their review of my podcast was my fiercely loyal audience. And that was a great honor, because I know that I do have folks out there who have listened to all 300 and, as of this morning, 301 episodes. And that's a lot of listening to me. So obviously they're finding something that they're connecting to. But that's also been one of the reasons why I've experimented with different series, because I know that everything's not for everyone. And I understand that. My main goal is to try and help folks to connect to U.S. presidential history, to be able to find something in that they do connect to and that may spark more learning for them, that they may go and read more about it or listen to other podcasts. If I can do that, even if they just listen to one episode, then I've done what I've set out to do. And I've asked folks over the years, I've occasionally posted polls like, which series are you really interested in? Do you listen to all of them? And I do have folks who just listen to certain types of episodes, whether it's the narrative series or one of the focus episodes or my interview episodes. But then I have folks who listen to all of them. So it's like, you know what? I'm having fun doing it. It's obvious that you're getting something from it. So let's just keep going.
Do you see podcasting as a viable long-term career, or at least a career path for historians? Or is it still sort of a passion-driven medium and there's only the very few at the top that can turn it into a career?
I think that it is a viable career option for folks, in that I think that you sometimes have to get creative. And very few podcasters get to the point of it being their full career. I wish that I was one of those. I'm unfortunately not. I still have my day job. So, but I think that it is something that is a way to really engage the public. And I do encourage historians and history scholars if they're interested in pursuing a podcast or, being a guest on a podcast, because it is a way to kind of bridge that gap. Like I said earlier, I try and point folks towards great scholarship. I want folks to know that these people are here doing this great work. What better way? I'm the secondary source. They're the primary source. So if they want to pursue podcasting, and I think that there is some advantage that they have in terms of being able to find partnerships with nonprofit groups that may be able to help them, that this becomes something that is part of their career path. So I think that there is an option for that. It's just trying to get creative, and it may be combined with speaking engagements, with, book deals, with things like that. But I think that it is something that is worth considering if it is an option. Unfortunately, that's one of the things right now, humanities and humanities studies are increasingly under pressure. And so you have great scholars out there who are trying to figure out how to make things work. And so maybe that is an option for them, because we need history. We need history scholars. We need to understand our past in order to be able to move into our future.
Now, you mentioned a little bit earlier about how you're using some of those AI tools that are embedded in platforms like Riverside to help you with, the production side of producing a podcast. I'm wondering if you could sort of wave a magic wand and gain access to a tool or a suite of tools to help you promote your podcast. What do you think that tool would do for you?
Oh, gosh. If I could have something that would help make editing faster, that would be fantastic. And I know many podcasters who work on their own editing, that's one of their biggest complaints. That's the biggest slog of it, is editing. I do engage with some other folks. I do bring in some other folks to do some of my editing for me, but there's still a good bit of it that I do myself. I would love to have something that would make it faster, but then also ensure that it is what I'm looking for, because there is such a thing as audio that is edited too much. You want it to sound a little organic, but maybe you don't need every little breath. Maybe you have that thing in the background that you don't realize until you go to edit and you're like, oh my gosh, that happened. There was a noise. It would be great to have some kind of tool that would make that faster. And it has gotten better, I will say. And that is one thing that AI is helping with, because I do my manual editing process and then run it through a generator just to see if there's anything else that I missed, if it can work on normalizing some of the audio. It does help with that. So it's gotten easier, but if I had something that I could just say, go to work, all I want to do is review it at the end, that would be fantastic.
I want to switch gears again and just talk about how you feel about the way your podcast and history podcasts sort of fit into our modern discourse. I think we live in an era of deep distrust towards institutions, media, government, history itself in some ways. How do you think about establishing that credibility with, your audience and anybody that listens to you, especially the ones that arrive skeptical? And, what do you think that, your research leads you somewhere that maybe challenges their existing views of a president, maybe that they admire, maybe that, they despise, but you're sort of turning it on its head and telling them, you know what, maybe this guy wasn't so bad, or maybe this guy wasn't as good as you thought. How do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I do start with and folks have commented on how much research I do. So usually when I get to the end of a presidential series, I have over 300 at least sources that I've cited in the series.
Wow.
And that can be everything from articles to maybe there's the biographical directory of the United States Congress. Maybe it's something at the Library of Congress, but also books, scholarly books, just really trying to do that deep dive. For me, that's where it starts. That's where establishing my credibility starts, because I want to understand this not just from one viewpoint. I want to engage with multiple sources to be able to say that I feel like I have a good handle on what the scholarship is telling us.
Right.
Now, with that said, I also try to stress to folks that history is something that we know what we know. And we may not know that we don't know something, because there may be a source out there that is not currently available, but somebody finds a trove of letters in an attic somewhere that completely reshapes our thinking. It doesn't happen all that often, and there's still the possibility. So when I'm working on an episode and when I'm putting this narrative together, one of the things I do try and make clear is when I am citing from, a primary source, a letter, an essay, whatever, when I'm citing from a secondary source. And then when I tell the listeners, okay, take this with a grain of salt. This is just what I'm seeing here. I can't really say for certain this is what's happening, but I try and make sure that they understand where all of this is coming from. And when I do have a point that, with all that I know, here's what I think, but, that may not be the way it is. So I try to make that very clear. In terms of kind of the larger question about, being able to engage with things that may be challenging, I think we should always do that. I think that it's important to look at anything with questions, with curiosity. And I know it can be challenging. And especially, I've had that. I've had figures that I have really been interested in. It's like, oh, this is going great. And then I learned that something that, oh, hold on, that took a dark turn. Where did that come from? Or from the other way. And this is one that I still have back and forths with folks about, Aaron Burr. So Aaron Burr is seen as, the villain of the early republic. He is this guy who was always plotting. He was manipulative. He had his own purpose. He was trying to become an emperor, all of this. Except that when you start to look into the scholarship and you look at where this is coming from, you realize that a lot of this is coming from his enemies. And there's some things about the standard narrative of what folks know in general about Aaron Burr that when you start to look at it, you say, hold on, that doesn't seem right. What is really going on here? And it's not to say that he wasn't scheming. He was. It's not to say that he didn't have plots going on. He did. I think that it has been overemphasized, and I think that there were some good aspects of him. And I think that when you study, and I do ascribe to the whole person approach to it. Nobody is completely good. Nobody is completely evil. We are all flawed individuals. We try to lean into our strengths, and we also have our shortcomings. We have things that we do that may not be quite as admirable, and how that works is on a spectrum. There are some folks who lean more towards the not so good side than the good side. it's important to understand all of that in these figures because they're people. They're not statues. They're not demons. They are people just like us. And again, that's part of what I draw from history is knowing that these are people just like me who were, I think for the most part, trying to do the best that they could. And whether they succeeded or not, history will tell. We can all reach our own conclusions, but it's important to see them as whole people. And I invite folks when they hear something challenging about somebody that they admired, or on the reverse, if there's somebody who's just completely demonized, I invite them to kind of do a little more digging, see if there's something good there, if there's something that may be missed, or maybe history has been written by the victors and, maybe there's a little more there. I invite them to do that, to keep an open mind, because ultimately when I've had those times that I've had that, that hero who has been brought down a little bit because I've discovered something, I usually end up thinking more of them in terms of seeing them as an individual than just my previous seeing them as the statue, the statue on a pedestal somewhere. It's just so much richer to see them as people.
I'm curious about how you think about podcast discovery, because the way I feel about it is that podcasts are perhaps, one of the last bastions that hasn't been fully infected with that sort of algorithmic discovery that you see on many other platforms, almost all the other platforms. Now, some of the podcast apps, the players, are now starting to experiment with that. But for the most part, as a podcast listener, as let's say you're like me and you really enjoy history podcasts, you still, for the most part, control entirely what you listen to, how you create that, media diet for yourself in terms of the things that you're interested in listening to. And I'm wondering, how you think about that in terms of whether that's kind of a feature or a bug as it relates to civic discourse, because, we not too long ago went through another presidential election, and there was a lot of talk about how podcasts perhaps had a role to play there in terms of misinformation, platforming certain candidates, not platforming others. And I feel like, despite a lack of algorithmic influence, people can still very easily box themselves into these echo chambers where they, choose to only consume, certain podcasts, certain media. They get on the Joe Rogan train and then they follow all the nonsense around that, and they follow other podcasters that are similar to him. And that's just an example, obviously, but I'm wondering how you think about that.
So I'll start kind of where I started myself, and then I'll kind of expand out from there. Because one of the things that I try to tell folks who are thinking about starting a podcast, and if they get stuck on that idea of how are people going to find me? How is this, how am I going to build an audience? What do I do with this? How do I get myself out there? I tell them, if you are bringing your passion, if you're bringing your expertise, if you're bringing what you're interested in to the podcast, you will find your audience. Your audience is out there and you will find them. It's tough because there are so many podcasts, and even beyond that, there's just so much media. And last time I checked, we still only have 24 hours in a day, and 8 hours of that, I'm hoping that everybody gets their 8 hours, is spent sleeping. So how do we convince folks that, some of your valuable time is important, that what I'm offering as a podcaster is important enough to take a little bit of that time of your day? And it really does I think the passion has to be for the listener as well. It has to be something that they're interested in. And so that's part of my work as a podcaster, is to try and help to make that easier, to help them to understand, to see what they can connect. And that's, for me, where social media comes in. That's a way of being able to kind of use the algorithm to my advantage, to get in front of somebody who may not have found me otherwise. And it doesn't always work, it's just hit or miss. I will say, even in the 21st century, word of mouth is still the best marketing out there. And so that's why my audience is so important to me, because I know they're out there doing that work. They're telling folks about the podcast. They're telling folks, you need to listen to this. And I cannot thank them enough for that. And it's really interesting when you get to that point. So I spoke at history camp a couple of years back at Valley Forge, had a friend in my non-podcasting life join us for that. And afterwards, she was like, Jerry, people were coming up to you. Did you actually know those people? I was like, no, I've never met them before. But they would be like, oh, Jerry from the Presidencies podcast. Like, hi, how's it going? And she was just like, you actually have people recognize you? Yes. And I've had friends say, that somebody that they knew was listening to me. I have no connection to them. I didn't know that they were listening. And it's a weird place, but it really is organic. But
that's a really good point too, because I think it speaks to the relationships, the sort of parasocial relationships that people build up with podcasters, and they're in their ears, so they develop a great deal of trust. And I think, a lot of people give podcasters a lot of power over, how they think about things.
Yes. And to your point, Sebastian, that's something that I do try to keep in mind. And that is one of the reasons why making sure that folks feel that I am credible is so important. And if I'm wrong, please tell me. I don't want anybody to just assume on Jerry's word that this is the gospel truth. I want to encourage folks to explore more, to do more research, to engage with sources that maybe in my 300 plus that I've engaged with this series, maybe there are others out there that I haven't, and there probably are. I'd love to hear more. I'd love to hear if there is another perspective. I think in terms of the echo chamber, it's a human thing. And being somebody who is engaged in the work of studying history, you see it time and time again. This isn't a new thing. It's different because there's so much media out there. There's no way anybody can consume all of it.
No.
But we do tend to draw ourselves towards the things that we relate to, or that we're interested in, or that fit our viewpoint. It's more comfort. It helps us to kind of validate what we already think. And one of the things that I take as a charge for myself, and I invite others to, be curious. I know what I know now, and there's so much more to learn. And I want everybody to embrace that lifelong learning. Don't just stop with what you know. Figure out what you don't know and learn it, because that is what life is all about. That is the joy of it. That is growth. It's an amazing place to be, and you're not alone. There are so many people out there. We're all learning. We're all growing. Get out of the echo chamber. It can be tough sometimes. And I'll admit myself, in terms of my podcast queue, it's pretty much history podcasts because I love history. And I try to, on a regular basis, add in something else, try and find a new podcast that I haven't listened to before. If I come across something that just piques my interest or somebody tells me about a podcast, just go and try an episode, just check it out. It's also where collaborations are so important for podcasters because we can help one another to grow. We want to be able to encourage folks to engage with other podcasts, go outside of just, U.S. presidential history, see what else is out there, and see what new perspectives you may bring back to what you're really interested in. That's the joy of it. So if listeners don't take anything else away from our discussion, I encourage you, be a lifelong learner, explore, try and be curious about the world. Don't just stick in one little echo chamber. It is so important to see what all is out there. And believe me, it's amazing. It can be challenging. And that's where the magic happens.
I think that's all really good advice. Okay, Jerry, final 2 questions. First, what are 3 podcasts you'd recommend?
So I'm going to go ahead and apologize because I have many podcasting friends out there. I'm sorry if I don't, if you're
Can't
not
mention them all.
If you're not in the top 3, please know you have a place. I did want to highlight 3 that, I can speak to their scholarship, and I can also speak to that they are great folks in terms of supporting the history podcast community, in terms of supporting me. I greatly appreciate what all they've done for me and their friendship, and I've learned from all of them. So first up, Civics and Coffee. Alicia is an amazing podcaster. She, like me, is just so excited about engaging in work of American history. And we always joke because her tagline is history in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. And I'm like, you may need a few cups. You may need the whole pot to get done with the Presidencies episode. So I'm sorry, but it is amazing what she's able to do in that short time frame. And it's always great work. It's always insightful. So highly recommend that one. The Turning Tides podcast. So Joe is like me. He loves the deep dive into topics. His is focused on different parts of history, but you can do deep dives into special topics. I actually am going to be releasing, we did 1 episode already on kind of the history of Puerto Rico and how the U.S. has played a role in that over time. I've got another episode. We had a great conversation kind of taking that narrative forward. So I'm excited to be able to release that, but I just always appreciate the work that he's doing. And then a flat pack history of Sweden. So Chris and Elsa are, like me, just so passionate about history, but in this case, it's the history of Sweden. And I love the work that they're doing. They do the deep dive on their podcast, but it's very approachable and they're just such amazing people. And then, like me, they decided to branch out a little bit. So they have a new special series called Kingdom, where they look at the monarchs of Sweden. I just appreciate all the work that they do, and I cannot thank them enough. But for those who were not in that group of 3, please know I value you as well. So I'm sorry. You're great as well.
They'll forgive you. Yeah, they'll forgive you. Don't worry. And where can people find you online?
So the best place to find me is the website, presidenciespodcast.com, but I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. I'm on all the major podcast platforms. So if you have a podcast app of choice, just type in Presidencies Podcast. You'll find me.
Excellent. Okay, Jerry, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod. And if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.